Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and there are wonderful, vibrant Jewish communities throughout America. Communities with a long and rich history of Jewish life. Jewish life is not simply the Eastern Corridor from Boston to Baltimore to Atlanta to Miami Beach. But New York has been the traditional Jewish gateway into America. And Ellis Island and the Lower East Side are virtually synonymous with much of Jewish immigration to the United States. And many of the major institutions of Jewish life were born here or have been located in Jewish New York. And for New York Jews, whether they live on the Upper West Side, or the East Side, or the Bronx off the Grand Concourse, or in Brooklyn's Williamsburg, Forest Hills, Queens, it's as if everyone is Jewish. So much so that the term New Yorkers has been used as an anti-Semitic slur at various times in American history. So no matter where you live throughout the country, or the world for that matter, the history of Jews of New York is a subject of universal interest, which is why you may find a wonderful new book on this very subject, absolutely fascinating. It's entitled Jewish New York, The Remarkable Story of a City and a People, published by New York University Press. Is the combined work of a number of American Jewry's foremost historians, and I'm thrilled to be sitting with two of them on this edition of L'Chaim. It is my pleasure to reintroduce to you Dr. Deborah Moore, the Frederick G. L. Hudwell Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and she was the principal steward of Jewish New York. And I'm also pleased to welcome back to L'Chaim a fan favorite, someone you've seen many times before on JBS, Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock, the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, and he was one of the major contributors to Jewish New York. And it is such a pleasure to be sitting with both of you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Deborah, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
A wonderful book. It's I was about to say, it is a book that spans so much of the history, not simply of Jewish New York. When you read this book, you know, you have a sense you're reading about the Jews of America. Mm-hmm. And again, you heard in the intro, I'm not suggesting New York is synonymous with Jews across the country. But in so many ways, your book touches on the heart of what it meant to become a Jew as you entered America. First of all, do you feel what I'm saying is fair?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, I had said to Jeff and to others that one has to keep in mind when you think of Jewish New York and New York City more broadly, that it's not just that this was the largest Jewish city in history, but that more Jews ended up living in New York than lived in any number of countries in Europe.
Yes.
More Jews than in England, than in France, than in Italy.
In New York City.
Just living in New York City. So in some ways, while we have all these national histories of Jews, of French Jews or whatever, this is really the first time that we have a history of Jews in New York, which is comparable in its comprehensiveness and vision.
By the way, everybody asks you, but you should be asked. What's the genesis of this book? How did you come to do it?
So this was a collaborative project. I was approached back, gosh, over a decade ago, by Jennifer Hammer, who's the editor that we worked with at NYU Press. And she thought that this was a real lacuna, that there was nothing on Jewish New York. There were all these specific studies, right?
Yes.
Jeff Gurock
I mean,
wrote on
there's
Harlem.
So much has been written about New York Jews, monographs. Both
Right.
nonfiction, of course fictionalized, but no one put the entire story together. So Jennifer very wisely turned to Deborah to recruit a group of scholars
Right.
to work with her in producing what
Very
was
interesting.
So there were 3 volumes before, right?
Yes, that's right.
And Jeffrey wrote the 3rd of the 3 volumes, and each of these volumes had either a single or a pair of authors. So that was the original vision, and part of it was eventually to pull it all together into a single volume, which was not so easy.
It's
But-
a very difficult job she undertook
Yes.
because you had 5 scholars,
Yes.
3 people doing their own individual
Yes.
books. You had Howard Rock, who did the colonial early national period. Dan Sawyer and Andy Pollin did the middle period, which is the immigration period, which Irwin is so interested in. And I did from 1920 to 2010. With Deborah correctly said the stewardship. But the beauty of this book is to take these 3 different voices, not to mention there's a photographic display,
Yes.
okay, and put it together in a coherent book. So when we as authors look at this book, we recognize many of our words, but we also recognize that she added to this her own perspective on New York Jewry. And one of the things that she's very strong about is she's totally aware of the cultural contributions that Jews made in this city.
Absolutely.
Whether it's in music and theater and things of that sort,
Yes.
which might have been missing from some of these other
Interesting.
pieces. So
This is a synthesis of sorts.
So it's a synthesis,
Yes.
right?
By the way, again, I want the audience to understand it's a very easy read, which
Thank
is
you. Yes.
congratulations to all of you.
Yeah.
You read it and you just want to, it's a story. You tell a story.
That is
In fact,
right.
you say it's the remarkable story
Yeah.
of both
Yeah.
a city and a people. Where were you born?
I was born in New York City, in Manhattan.
How long did you live in New York?
I've lived most of my life in New York.
Is it fair
yes.
to call you a New Yorker?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Where were you born?
I was born in the Bronx, New York, where I acquired my distinctive dialect, of which I'm very, very proud. And I've lived in New York City, with the exception of 1 year in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was really, and my wife and I were really immigrants in a strange land. And, you know, it's interesting. Out there, we were seen as New York Jews. And when I was working on my dissertation, which became a Harlem book, a close friend of ours was working at the next microfilm machine, and he had mailed him every day, not the New York Times, which is the newspaper of record, which makes abundant sense. He had the New York Post mailed to him. Because the sports page and page 6 perhaps, etc. And that was a bonding experience because this is what made us New Yorkers. We had a different perspective on life, different from wonderful people in Cincinnati who lived a very different style of life.
Okay.
And I wonder at one point they were saying, at what point will Gurock and Cohen leave and we can continue our lives? But
Yes.
I lived all my life in New York
Yes.
City.
You're talking about Norman Cohen, who also got his PhD as well as yours. Incidentally, speak about that for one more moment. And I wanted both of you to address this because your book does deal with this in a couple of chapters. What is the unique perspective? Doesn't mean it's a better perspective, but what is the unique perspective when you talk about the fact that you were in a strange land in Cincinnati, Ohio, and that you were viewed by other Jews as a different character of sorts? What's that about? What's it mean? What is the difference? What if I had here Jews from Seattle and Denver and St. Louis and Houston? What do you think how do you think they would describe the New York Jew?
So I think one thing that's distinctive about the New York Jew that comes across in a variety of the chapters is that if you live in New York City, particular neighborhoods at different times, you can believe that the whole world is Jewish. even though statistically we never lived in a ghettoized situation. Even on the Lower East Side, there were significant numbers of Christians living among us, and a sense of we belong to the city is ours, and we are part of that. And that creates within a New Yorker a sense of comfort about being a New York Jew, and then transplanted someplace else, you find yourself as a member of a minority group. This city, and by the way, this is not only a story about the history of the Jews of New York, it is also a remarkable story of a city and how Jews are part of the city and the evolution of the city over 3.5 centuries. Those are the types of things that I think come through in this book. The New York Jewish experience could be very different from someone who is a minority group member in Cincinnati, St. Louis, Seattle, and the like.
I would add that New York Jews live their Jewishness outdoors and not just indoors.
Meaning what?
It's on the street. It's in friendship patterns of people whom they meet on the street. It's in the stores and other shops that help to make the street culture. It's their own way in which the geography of the city matters to them. There are certain parts of the city that New York Jews don't go to. Because there's nothing Jewish about them. There were certain sections of the city where there was discrimination and Jews couldn't live at different points of time. But so Jewishness is something that exists outside. It's supported by the urban culture itself. It's not something private, personal inside. It can be that as well, but there's an outdoors piece to it. And that, for other people, is very surprising because you're used to, as a New York Jew, walking the streets as a Jew and not trying to be something else.
So one of the people I profiled in my section of the book was a basketball player named Dolph Shays, who grew up a few blocks west of the Grand Concourse. And he told me that when he was growing up,
in the interwar years.
In the interwar years, right, when he went to Crescent Junior High School in the 1930s, DeWitt Clinton High School, and then on to NYU, where he became an All-American basketball player, he thought everybody in the neighborhood was Jewish, even though, when you look at the numbers, only 7 out of 10 people. What was Jewish? Deborah's 100% right. The candy store, the butcher shop, the bakery, the garment store, etc. And I asked him, did you ever go to a synagogue? Were you bar mitzvahed? And if you walk up and down the Grand Concourse this day, you'll see all these churches that were synagogues. He said, I was never bar mitzvahed, I never went to synagogue, and yet I felt that the whole world was Jewish. Also what was Jewish was his mother's Romanian culinary arts, which the foods that they ate. This is what made him Jewish. Footnote, at the end of his life, he lived in Syracuse, New York, and he was very involved in the men's club of a conservative synagogue. The synagogue became for him a touchstone of his Jewishness, whereas the streets of the Grand Concourse, or the few blocks off the Grand Concourse, were the way he expressed himself as a Jew. The funny part about NYU is that NYU Uptown was built in the 1910s by the university, based upon the idea that they want to create an uptown version of NYU to get away from the immigrants downtown, the Washington Square camps. Little did they know that right after World War I, they would be inundated with Jews and other immigrants or second-generation people who moved into the neighborhood. So they established some quota systems for NYU uptown, not downtown. But Dolph Shays got in because besides being a good student, he was a heck of a basketball player and 6'8", so that helped.
By the way, in New York, it's not like I don't see this now when I go to other cities. But it was earlier in New York that Jews felt comfortable wearing a yarmulke, a kippah, in the street, or wearing tzitzit that could be seen. And I'm not sure that when you used the word comfort at the very beginning, there was a comfort level to the Jewish community in New York that was unique, yes?
Oh, yes. I think partly it's because of the numbers and indeed also the diversity. So one of the people whom we don't quote, but I remember saying, in an interview was that, you know, in New York you could find anyone who was like you Jewishly. And that meant from an entire wide spectrum. And this particular person later became the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Gerson Cohen, said in the Bronx, if you wanted to find somebody who could to play baseball in Hebrew with, you could find that person. Mm-hmm. So there was just an enormous range of diversity among different types of Jews in the city as well.
And New York City is an immigrant city.
Yes.
It's an ethnic city. You know, in the 1960s, strange thing happened in the city of New York. A Protestant, a tall, blonde-haired Protestant who was a Protestant version, looked like John F. Kennedy, his name was John Lindsay, was elected mayor of the city of New York. How in the world was he elected? Well, we talk about that in the Jewish component thereof. But it's a city where I often tell my students, you're not encountering real live Gentiles. And I'm not saying that pejoratively. You're talking about people who see themselves as Italian New Yorkers, Irish New Yorkers, and Jewish New Yorkers who may have a lot in common and also great differences within that city. It's only when they move out do they discover America. And finally, you know, you talk about people who are yarmulkes and tzitzit. The downside to it, perhaps, is the fact that it permits a degree of parochialism among New York Jews that you won't see anyplace else.
Develop that idea a little bit.
Well, in other words, you're living among your own kind, and you're comfortable with your own background, your own customs, etc. And we talk in the book about Sephardic communities in Brooklyn who maintain their traditions. But at some point in your life, you're living in an America which is predominantly not Jewish. So how do you integrate yourself, acculturate yourself, without assimilating? So the issues for New York Jews in terms of embracing America as opposed to maintaining their own ways might be different from someone in Cincinnati, Seattle, or any place else in the city.
You know, it's interesting. In some way, Jews who grow up in New York really don't understand America. Because, as Jeff says, there's a tendency for any human being to believe the world is as they experience it. You grow up in New York, you assume it's this way. You assume the world is a liberal Jewish world. And the reality is that that America is much richer and broader than that. And I run into, Deborah, I run into people, and I receive emails and letters from people who watch JBS outside of New York. And they tell me, very often the people who we have on JBS who are in the New York area don't understand the issues and the problems and the fears and the challenges of Jewish life outside of New York. And there is something real to that, isn't there?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So I've been living in Ann Arbor since 2005.
Yes.
Okay, and that's Michigan. And Michigan has a very long history of prejudice against all kinds of minorities. The Klan, the Ku Klux Klan was very big in Michigan. The German-American Bund was very big in Michigan. You had Father Conklin preaching outside of Detroit. And you still have elements of white supremacist groups in Michigan. So it is a very different kind of experience. And I think that the issue has to do with how one lives as a minority, and whether one decides to do one's best to sort of pass into a sort of parve, a neutral, you know, kind of identity, or whether one decides that as a minority one is also going to speak out as a Jew. Now, for many years I was director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. So I was always, as they say, out as a Jew, and I was never trying to blend in. People knew who I was, but I'm aware of the difficulties that one faces as a minority. And actually, even in the history of New York, although we don't touch much on it, there are some Jews who move to certain sections of the city specifically because there are very low numbers of Jews. So you have some Jews who move to Flushing, for example, or Jews to, they pick areas that are not particularly Jewish. The Jews who are living in Queens in the early part of the 20th century, or even some in the interwar years, don't want to be around too many Jews. So that too is a choice that's part
Well,
of it.
there's some Jews who try to pass their way, if you will,
Yeah.
into Forest Hills.
Yep.
Forest Hills Garden, where the old tennis stadium used to be, which was off limits to Jews, really until after World War II. And then one of the ironies of Forest Hills history was that 20 years later, or 30 years later, during the Lindsay administration, there's an issue arises about building high-rise projects, as they were called. Projects always in New York City, a pejorative term, with African Americans, perhaps, and other minorities.
They were low income.
Low
income
right?
housing, yeah.
You have these elderly Jews, and you have African Americans, and some of the tensions that evolved there. But I wanted to say one other thing about the size of New York Jewry, and that is, to a great extent, it forces us or calls upon us as New York Jews. She's out there because she's with the Frankel Center in a small Jewish community. There is responsibilities that devolve upon New York Jews to be outspoken on behalf of their brethren during crisis times, and that's one of the things that interested me in terms of not only in our contemporary day, where the hub of the Soviet Jewry movement was in New York City. The hub of the emergence of Jewish feminism was in New York City. I've said recently that the west side of Manhattan in the 1960s was a place where you had the first woman rabbi of the Reform movement. You had Ezrat Nashim, which came out of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and our late
women's movement
that led to the ordination of women, and Lincoln Square Synagogue, which was the first Orthodox synagogue in America to have an Orthodox women's prayer group, all within, 3 square miles of one another, in the same area where there are thousands of Jews, men and women, who are not interested in all of them being Jewish. Such a complex type of
And New York permitted everyone to be what they wanted to be.
Correct.
Yes, right. And you had the regular feminists also living up there
for
as
sure.
well. Definitely.
But who had their impact upon the Jewish feminists and
Right.
vice versa.
Right.
Some of these Jewish feminists learn a lot about being Jewish from what I'll call religious Jewish feminists, who help create in them a greater sense of their own belonging to their people as women and as Jews. So there is this type of merging of identities that takes place in the city, which the rest of American Jewry and maybe America learns from the New York experience. And those who are opposed to feminism outside New York could lay the blame not only on New York, but on New York Jews.
Yeah.
So it cuts both ways.
So in Jewish New York, Deborah, you begin with a quote from a sergeant in the American Army who was writing for or quoted in Stars and Stripes, which is the publication of the American Army. And he says, of all the big cities, New York is still the promised land. That was in 1945.
Right.
Is still the promised land. What did he mean?
So in 1945, in a world that has been largely destroyed, certainly the European world and much of other parts of the Middle East as well, has seen a lot of destruction. New York, as the rest of the United States, of course, but New York was a place that had not seen destruction. It was a very Jewish city. It was close to 30% of its population was Jewish. It was a place where Jews felt secure. It was economically at a higher level than much of the rest of the country in terms of the average income. Politically, it was not just a liberal place, but it was progressive. It had very strong social welfare benefits. It had a good public health system. It had excellent unions that helped people maintain adequate wages and benefits. And it had this enormous variety of types of Jewish religious life. It embodied religious pluralism. So it was a combination of all of these things, plus the individual opportunity that it offered to Jews to fulfill themselves, whatever that fulfillment might be. So it was, in that sense, a promised land. It was a promised land for Jews individually. It was a promised land for Jews collectively. And it seemed to be the place where you could have an enormous impact on the world as well through New York if you wanted.
So in the 1950s, there's an article in Fortune magazine called The Jewish Elan of New York City, which talks about all those types of issues. One of the things that I address in my portion of this, which was the original third volume, is after 1945, moving up to the present day, to what extent do Jews still feel comfortable in New York City? And one of the conclusions I came to was it all depends on where you live and what your experience is, that this type of really positive vision of New York City remains intact for significant numbers of Jews. Other Jews feel frightened. They feel in certain instances that the government of the city of New York is no longer on their side. Some deal with it by leaving New York, fleeing New York, or moving to other neighborhoods in New York. So and this is seen politically. I addressed a few moments ago Lindsay winning election. If you look at the Jewish vote, well, there are different types of Jewish votes. There's a liberal Jewish vote in people who are in neighborhoods who are very comfortable where they are, and there are people who are in other neighborhoods or very frightened. So you see strange alliances. You see Jews, Italians, and Irish voting more conservative, capital C, ticket, as opposed to Jews, affluent Jews, acculturated Jews, who are voting for in a liberal way. And perhaps that sort of dimension continues to this day. So from a period where after World War II, and America comes out of World War II unscathed in terms of the destruction, great sense of being a great country. Jews buy into it. Jews gain a great deal of acceptance they didn't have prior to that time. It's a very, very good time. And I'm suggesting that 60 or 65 years later, it's still a good time for some Jews, and for other Jews, not such a good time. And
for whom? Whom is it not a good time?
Well, Jews, poor Jews, elderly Jews, Jews in changing neighborhoods who are frightened by incursions of African Americans, Latinos into their neighborhoods, and then people living in what I talk about two fair zones, people who are away from the inner city, but within the heart of the metropolis, who feel very comfortable in the city. So you go neighborhood by neighborhood, and within neighborhoods, you see different visions of what it means to live in New York. And again, one of the things that all of the authors that synthesized in Deborah's book had to do was say, well, what's going on in New York at a particular point in time, and how the Jewish story intersects with New York's history.
Yes.
And again, I keep emphasizing that it's a story of Jews.
And also?
And it's also Gotham. It's also New York.
Okay. Part of New York is the harbor, where you have the Statue of Liberty and you have Ellis Island. And for Jews at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, America was the golden Medina. It wasn't that the streets were literally paved with gold, but there was a notion in parts of Eastern European Jewry that if they made it to America, they were going to have a significantly, it was true by the way, a significantly better life than they had in Eastern Europe. When you talk in your book about 1945, and again, the first quote in your book comes from somebody who's speaking in 1945. It is not that that's the first time that Jews looked at New York as the promised land, correct? So speak for one moment, pre-45, for the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. What was New York for the Jews who were immigrating in the late 1800s and the early 1900s?
Okay, so New York could aptly be called the Promised City, which is a title of another book about Jewish immigrants in New York. Immigration and migration more generally is something that is selective. That is, not everybody does it. So although ultimately 1/3 of the Jews left Eastern Europe, right, and emigrated, and most of them came to the United States, New York City drew a certain selection of Jews. It didn't draw the rich Jews or the most educated Jews, and it didn't draw that many of the most pious Jews. But for a big middle stratum of Jews, it was a place where if you were willing to work, right, the city offered you opportunities. It offered you opportunities for economic mobility. It offered you opportunities to get an education, a free education, especially for your children. It offered you a place to live, usually not such a great place, but still, you know, a place to live.
Everything's relative, by the way.
Everything's
it was
relative.
better than
That's
where
correct.
they came from.
That's right. It offered you food, which was unbelievably plentiful. From the point of view of immigrants. I mean, there's this wonderful parrot story where a bunch of Schweig, where this guy dies and he's had nothing all his life, and when he's asked what's the one thing he wants, it's a fresh roll with butter, right? Well, you could get a fresh roll with butter every morning for
It gave me
pennies.
chills. That's a great story.
Yes.
Great story, yes. I want you to give me, you know, a 1 or 2 minute overview of the Jewish cultural journey of the Jews of New York. Everybody knows about the Lower East Side and the Yiddish theater, and you give tours of the Lower East Side. But Jewish culture is more than just the East. It's certainly part of it, and I want you to address that. But in a few moments, just take us, what was this within the Jewish culture, not how it affected New York culture necessarily, but if one was, you know, doing a review of the Jewish cultural evolution of the Jewish community in New York, what are some of the highlights?
Well, see, you anticipated what I was going to say. One of the most important Jewish playwrights of the late 19th, 20th century, Israel Zangwill, who was also president of the Territorialist organization, which tried to find refuge havens for Jews before World War I, was involved with a variety of plans to move Jews from New York, out of New York to Midwest, Far West, etc., or through Galveston, the Galveston plan, getting boats to not go to New York, but end up. And yet he found out that a lot of these Jews wouldn't go there. And he once said, and I hope I quoted it right, during summertime, New York is like hell. And I can never understand really how these Jews could live in these small tenement rooms. Yet if given the opportunity to go elsewhere, here's what I'd say: let you millionaires go elsewhere. You possess so many resources. I possess but one thing. I possess my Jewish culture. And that Jewish culture can be expressed in a variety of ways. We talked about what life was like in 1945, even more so going back in time in terms of connections that Jews have with one another. You talked about Yiddish theater and newspapers. Those are institutional landmarks, but I'm talking about the fact that you're among your own kind. You may be working in a sweatshop, but you're working with a Jew. If you're a traditional Jew, perhaps, if you're a man, they give you 10 minutes off during the afternoon to say the afternoon prayers, things of that sort. There is this embodiment of being Jewish downtown and in successor neighborhoods. And Deborah was the first to really point out to us in an earlier work that when Jews leave the Lower East Side, yes, some Jews end up going to places where there are no Jews, but they move together. They move together because they want to maintain this sense of Jewishness. Again, the Dav Sheser, which is not rooted necessarily in institutions, but rooted in the fact that they are among their own kind. So they move from the Lower East Side. Perhaps they'll move to Harlem or Williamsburg or Brownsville before World War I. And in Deborah's early work, she talks about Jews moving to the Bronx and to other places in Manhattan and Brooklyn, etc. And when you look at how many Jews are living in these areas, I'm preaching to the choir here because she taught us this. Okay, the fact of the matter is, these are still people still wanting to live among Jews, working among Jews, and interacting among Jews.
So one of the things, if I can add to that, yes. So if you take Brooklyn versus the Bronx, and I said something about how migration, sorts people. It pulls certain people in different directions. So neighborhoods began to acquire certain characteristics. And you find in the Bronx, for example, a lot of left-wing Jews move there. They move there in part because they experiment with cooperative housing projects that they develop. The unions support some of them. Some of them are supported by political organizations or fraternal organizations. But the result is that you get a left-wing culture in the Bronx that is far more vigorous than the left-wing culture in parts of Brooklyn. And instead in Brooklyn, you get Jews who become supporters of the Zionist movement, and Jews who are engaged in conservative Judaism, and Jews involved in modern Orthodoxy. So Brooklyn ends up having a slightly more, some of these different neighborhoods, slightly more religious cast to it. Which is not to say that you don't have religious Jews in the Bronx, or you don't have left-wing Jews in Brooklyn. You do, but there are certain larger characteristics. One of the things that's really interesting to look at, if you want to sort of chart the arc of Jewish culture, are the ways in which Jews come to embed their culture in the city itself. And so as Jews leave behind the Yiddish language in the second and third generations, they start to produce things in the English language. And what they write in English, how they enter the publishing industry. The English publishing industry is part of the story that we tell. They come to change the character of Broadway also. The rise of Broadway musicals is part of a Jewish kind of story.
Oh, wait, for how long was New York a synonym for Manhattan? Because very often, although we know there was a strong Jewish presence in the Bronx, there was a Jewish presence in Brooklyn, at the same time, there is almost an instinctive association between Jewish New York and Manhattan, the island of Manhattan.
So New York until 1898 was Manhattan, right, and the Bronx.
Right.
That's what New York was. So then you get the consolidation, and you add the city of Brooklyn. Brooklyn was the fourth largest city in the United States. So you have these two huge cities merging together. So you have it becomes a city of 5 boroughs. So it doesn't really become a city of 5 boroughs until the 20th century. And then Manhattan retains its importance because that's where Wall Street is, and that's where, Fifth Avenue shopping, and that's where Broadway, the theater district is, and, the cultural centers.
I want to say that people who live in the Bronx would say, I live in the Bronx, but I'm coming into the city to go to theater, to go to opera.
And that's what the sign on the subway would say. It would say, to the
city. Right. And so you see Manhattan as a New York cultural center, but in terms of your Jewish life, I think your Jewish life is rooted in a diversified type of neighborhood experience. And one thing that I've tried to nuance beyond the idea that Williamsburg was this and Brownsville was this and the Bronx was this, that I try to make distinction between Jews who are active participants and people who are passive participants. Truly, the cooperative areas in the Bronx had a left-wing culture to it, but there are a variety of people who are living there because the price is right to live there, and they might belong to the IWW, International Workers of the World, because they have the best death benefits. All I'm saying is the neighborhood is very powerful, and there are ideological commitments, and there are those who are not nearly as involved in that sort of thing.
Okay. By the way, to what extent were the 3 baseball teams in the 20th century, especially in the 40s and the 50s, the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees, to what extent was there in some way did who you root for in some way reflect where you were in the Jewish community?
Brooklyn Jews loved the Dodgers.
They did.
They loved the Dodgers. Brooklyn Christians loved the Dodgers. When Gil Hodges went like 0 for 14 in the World Series, he was receiving rosary beads and mezuzahs from a variety of people. So Brooklyn Jews and Brooklyn Dodgers. The Yankees were a problem because on the one hand, if you live in the Bronx like I did, that was the team for your borough. On the other hand, the Yankees had this cachet of being very exclusive. They were very late to have African-American players, and there was also some sense that Jews were not nearly as welcome on the Yankees. So I think depending on where you live had a lot to say about your allegiances, but people who were sensitive to some of the nuances of this sort of thing, what I'm saying is Brooklyn Jews and Brooklyn Dodgers were synonymous as far as the Giants in Upper Manhattan and the Yankees over the water, River Avenue in the Bronx. It was a little bit different.
Very interesting.
Right.
And what about, I asked you again, what about the development of Jewish culture? And I am speaking about the things that are associated with the Lower East Side. How did that develop?
What do you mean in terms of Jewish culture? The newspapers, the magazines, the hundreds of journals and things of that sort? Well, you have a reading public that is learning about America through their ethnic newspapers. It's not, by the way, it's not only a Jewish story, it's an Italian story, etc. So this is very much part of that sort of activity. The Yiddish theater is of two varieties. There's the Yiddish theater that talks about the types of shows which remind people of the place they left behind, you know, very histrionic, etc. And then there are attempts to upgrade the theater to make it more respectable. So that's also going on.
I think Yiddish theater in many ways, the more popular, what they would call shund or
Right.
trash in those days, is really analogous to what television shows were in the early years. In that, you know, they had relatively formulaic kinds of stories, and people had their favorite actors and actresses and stuff.
They were giants, though.
They were beloved, if that's
Beloved,
what you mean.
yes.
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 And some people went to them religiously.
Yes.
That is to say, rather than going, you know, Friday night, you know, to shul, they would go to the theater, right?
It was a religious experience for them. Yes. You mentioned
there is a Christian observer of the Lower East Side named Hutchins Hapgood, who talks about Orthodox Jews going to theater on Friday night, the beginning of the Sabbath, and he talks about the fact that in one of the shows, one of the actors takes out a lit cigar and smokes it, and the people in the audience are yelling, "Shanda, Shanda, Shanda! No, 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 no smoking on the Sabbath!" From what he calls the proletarian hypocrites. So you had that going on as well.
Okay. You mentioned already, you referenced the fact that you were in Cincinnati. You studied at the Hebrew Union College.
Correct. I wrote about Harlem studying in Cincinnati, right?
Okay.
Because of the marvelous library.
So lo and behold, Isaac Mayer Wise locates in Cincinnati, and that becomes the home of Reform Judaism. Obviously, it spreads out through America. We have Temple Emmanuel as a major Reform institution of Jewish life here. But in New York, you have the development of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, Solomon Schechter's creation, that at one point becomes the dominant identity of the Jewish community of America. You then have Mordechai Kaplan coming out of JTS and creating the Reconstructionist movement. You've written about Mordechai Kaplan as perhaps the single greatest influence on contemporary American Judaism. And then you have the development of Yeshiva University as an Orthodox stalwart representing mainstream Orthodoxy. We don't have time for this in large measure, but I do want you to speak for one moment about the Judaism contribution that emanates out of New York City.
I would add to that the role of Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
When?
Right?
When? Yes.
It's starting in the mid-60s.
Yeah, so that's later.
It's late.
Right.
Okay.
But
And
if we're
also-
going to, it's very New York. It's a very New York
Okay,
story.
fair enough.
They're everywhere. They start in New York.
They start in New York, but
And their home is in Brooklyn as opposed to
their home
Manhattan.
is in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn becomes a kind of sacred site for them. And the mitzvah mobiles and the notion of
Absolutely.
reaching out and converting people on the streets of the
Yes.
city. This is real New York also. So I'd put that into
Good for you.
the city as
And
part of the religion.
And Chabad, in all fairness, also gets involved in one of the very dicey, very problematic moments in time when their interaction with not African Americans but Afro-Caribbeans in the 1990s. One of the things that Chabad, what the Lubavitcher Rebbe says is other Jews are leaving New York, we're staying right here into a neighborhood that becomes more minority, and you have conflict there, and recently more resolution. So that's a story that has to be told as well, and we tell it in the book. Look, the seminary and yeshiva, the seminary is established to a great extent as a response to the Hebrew Union College in
Correct.
Cincinnati. And by the way, there's the Jewish Institute of Religion under Stephen Wise. You know, there are two Stephen Wises. There's the political Stephen Wise and there's religious Stephen Wise. It's part of the New York experience. And yeshiva, early yeshiva and the seminary have this looking over the shoulder at each other at this point. So that makes for a very complicated relationship. Has a lot to do with the fact that there's so many Jews here. There's so many Jews in both in terms of numbers, but also leadership situations that makes it possible to create these types of seminaries.
But so much of what American Judaism became
Right.
comes out of New York, whether it's Manhattan or Brooklyn, yes?
But look at what we said half an hour ago, when Deborah and I were talking about what Jewish feminism, Jewish religious feminism starts in New York and goes elsewhere. Perhaps if we go back to the turn of the 20th century, okay, with the exception of Henrietta Zold, who's widely exploited by people at the Jewish Logical Seminary, which is a story for another time. The fact of the matter is that 50, 60 years earlier, the efflorescence of American Judaism begins in New York in a comparable way and spreads out
Yes.
nationally,
Yes.
even before we talk about second stage feminism at that later on.
Yeah.
That's the Jewish component inside the Jewish community.
Right.
Can you speak for a moment about the contribution Jewish New York made to general culture, museums and theater and the like, which to a large extent were even supported by the Jews of New York?
Okay, so one of the things one has to recognize is that there were certain cultural institutions that excluded Jews, right? Even though Jews wanted to be involved. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Opera, the Met Opera, the Museum of Natural History, these 19th century institutions, by and large, did not want Jews. So that meant that when Jews began to produce culture, that was for a broad American audience, they did it in alternative kinds of modes. So publishing, for example, is one of the areas that Jews innovate in New York City, and that leads to the publishing industry leaving Boston and coming into New York. And what are the kinds of innovations? Paperback books, selling books in train stations, Book of the Month Club, sort of these new ways of understanding what publishing is about, and lots of translations of European writers. That becomes really important so that you're broadening Americans' reading habits. So publishing is one place. The theater never excluded Jews, and so Jews are actively involved in the Broadway theater, and certainly in terms of the creation of the American musical, which becomes sort of a signature of American culture. And this involves Jewish men as well as Jewish women, who are really important.
And what about some of the cultural institutions like Metropolitan Museum of Art and things of that nature?
Well, it takes a long time.
But look how things have changed.
Yeah.
Next time you go to Metropolitan Opera House, you go to a concert, you go to an opera, take a look at the program and look who the benefactors
different.
are of these institutions. Many of them are Jewish.
That's my point.
They
Yes.
are the children and grandchildren of some of these real estate people and builders who are now involved and accepted. It is a metaphor, by the way, for the acceptance of Jews. Now, I said a while back that this is not a WASP city But there are some WASP preserves. We have invaded all those things, and I shouldn't say invaded because to some extent,
word,
because to some extent the people who are involved in these activities of Jewish ancestry don't have a strong sense of the Jewish identification. But the acceptance is very much part of that story. And as you move more and more into contemporary times, one of the issues for Jewish institutions today is, whether it's Yeshiva or Jewish Theological or Hebrew Union College, is that in terms of support for these activities, well, a lot of these Jews are far more comfortable in these preserves, which have become their own. So I didn't mean invasion that took over, but the level of acceptance is one of the things we often talk about on JBS, is that with the levels of acceptance Jews feel today, notwithstanding some of the rotten things that are happening at this contemporary time in 2017, the fact is Jews are very much accepted, and it can be seen within their participation in these areas which at one point were off limits to Jews.
So I would say that the fiscal crisis of the mid-70s was really crucial in this regard, because what the fiscal crisis did was to change the character of city government, and it brought financiers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in to save the city, since they were unable to get federal money, right? I mean, Ford wasn't going to help the city out at that time. President Ford, yes.
We have a picture in the book of Abe Beam, the first Jewish mayor. Ford to New York, dropped dead.
Right,
Very iconic moment in time.
Iconic moment.
Right.
But it also meant that the Jewish labor leaders were crucial for saving the city, because they took their pension funds and they invested in city bonds at a time when the banks would have nothing to do with it. So when you look post financial crisis, you see there's a whole shuffling, a reshuffle, and Ed Koch follows, right? Beam as mayor. You see a reshuffling of people who are committed to the city, even as the population of the city is stagnating, and the Jewish population has drops enormously in the 70s. And so this kind of change of Jewish involvement in these major cultural institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the opera is a post-75 involvement, when the character of the city changes, and you begin to talk about Jews no longer as almost 30% of the population, but now as a significant percentage of the white population of the city.
By the way, to what extent do you think that New York becomes in some way a very powerful microcosm of what American Jewry becomes?
I would say that if you're going to talk about cities, big cities, Chicago, LA,
Boston.
Miami, right, Boston, Philly, then there are real urban commonalities that you can find in terms of the Jewish experience, and also how Jews get involved and engaged with cities. I mean, the kinds of cultural participation that we were just talking about for New York Jews is characteristic of Jews in Miami, right? They've helped to build museums, and right? I mean, yes, and the same is true in LA.
She's very modest. She did a book called To the Golden Cities about Jews in LA and Miami, and she didn't mention the fact that a lot of the Jews who moved to Miami and LA are New York Jews, and they bring with them New York cultures, whether it's delicatessens or things of that sort, or the movie industry and things of that sort. And also, when they get to Miami and LA, not to mention our experience in Cincinnati, most of our close friends were erstwhile New Yorkers, so we take that with us, and we are seen by, not only by the Gentile world, but by, when are the Gurock's going to leave Cincinnati?
By the way, is there anything like a New York bagel? Is there anything like a New York corned beef sandwich?
One of our colleagues actually works in the area of Jewish delicatessens. You might ask him, but no, there's something special about New York.
So I want to end by coming back to the beginning.
Okay.
I want you to answer this, Deborah.
Yeah.
Why should this book, this wonderful book, Jewish New York, be of interest to a Jew who lives in Seattle or Denver or Atlanta or Houston?
First, I would say that I would hope it'd be of interest not just to a Jew who lives there, but to any American,
Yes.
because it's a great story. And it's a piece of American history that is still with us today and helps to shape the world in which we live. And if Jews and others who live out in Seattle want to understand their world involves not just that of Seattle, but all of the United States. And New York has had an outsized influence upon the entire United States on its politics, on its culture, on its finance.
And I would just add that in many respects, the responsibilities that have devolved upon New York Jews are important for all American Jews in terms of advocacy for Israel, years ago for Soviet Jewry and the like, and that we assumed a leadership role, which we still carry. To know what we're all about is very, very, very important. And not only are New York Jews significant to all Americans, so is New York.
So is New York.
And so is New York. And again, this book is about Jews, but it's also so much about New York City that people interested in the city's history, Jew or Gentile, should be interested in that sort of saga.
Gurock to you. It's a fabulous book. And you're wonderful. Thank you for being here. You, my friend, again, fan favorite. You're always fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. There you have it. Jewish New York. Deborah Moore, the Frederick G.L. Huitwell Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Jeffrey S. Gurock, the Libby M. Klapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. Deborah shepherded this book. Jeff contributed to this book. How many other historians here? 4 more? 3 more?
4 more.
It is a wonderful read, and as you've heard, it goes well beyond simply of interest to Jews who may have grown up in or now live in New York City. This is the story of the Jewish world and the story of a city that has been key to America's growth, New York City. I recommend Jewish New York to you full-heartedly. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed by Deborah or by Jeff. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And if you have your own New York story, let me hear it. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.